The grand ballroom looked perfect. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, filling the room with warm golden light. Round tables covered in white cloth stretched across the hall. Fresh flowers decorated every corner, and hotel staff moved quickly between guests, making sure everything was ready for the evening's charity gala. The event was one of the biggest of the year. Business owners, community leaders, and wealthy donors had traveled from different cities to attend. Everyone expected a night of elegance, speeches, fine dining, and beautiful music. Among the busy staff was a young woman carrying trays and helping prepare the room before guests fully arrived. She moved quietly and efficiently, never drawing attention to herself. Most people who saw her that evening assumed she was like any other employee working the event. They noticed her uniform, her polite smile, and her willingness to help whenever someone needed assistance. What they didn't know was that there had been a time when her life looked completely different. Years earlier, music had been the center of her world. As a child, she had fallen in love with the piano almost immediately. The first time she touched the keys, something clicked inside her. While other children spent hours watching television or playing outside, she spent every free moment practicing. Her family never had much money. The piano she learned on was old and worn. Several keys stuck when pressed, and some notes sounded slightly off. But none of that mattered to her. She played anyway. Every day after school, she sat in front of that piano and practiced until her fingers ached. Sometimes she played so long that her parents had to remind her to eat dinner. Her hard work paid off. Teachers noticed her talent. Local music instructors encouraged her. She began participating in small competitions and community performances. People often talked about her future and how far her gift might take her. For a while, it seemed those dreams were becoming reality. Then life changed. A series of family difficulties arrived one after another. Medical bills piled up. Financial problems grew worse. Responsibilities increased. Dreams that once seemed possible suddenly became luxuries her family could no longer afford. Music lessons stopped. Competitions ended. The future she had imagined slowly slipped away. At first, she told herself the break would only be temporary. A few months would pass, things would improve, and she would return to music. But months became years. Instead of performing on stages, she worked jobs. Instead of practicing for concerts, she worked long shifts to help support her family. Life demanded practical choices, and she made them without complaint. Yet no matter how busy she became, she never truly abandoned music. Whenever she had a free moment, she found a piano somewhere. Sometimes it was in a community center. Sometimes it was in a church. Sometimes it was an old instrument sitting and used in a friend's home. She played quietly, often when nobody was around. The piano remained the one place where she felt completely herself. Even so, very few people knew about this side of her life. At the hotel where she worked, almost nobody had heard her play. She preferred it that way. The attention never mattered to her. That evening, as guests began arriving at the gala, she focused on her responsibilities. She greeted visitors. She helped direct people toward their tables. She answered questions and solved small problems before they became larger ones. Everything seemed to be running smoothly. Then an unexpected issue appeared. Near the stage, several event organizers gathered together with worried expressions. One of them repeatedly checked a phone. Another paced back and forth. The young woman noticed their concern but continued working. Large events always came with challenges. Usually the organizers handled them without involving the staff. A few minutes later, however, the tension became impossible to ignore. Voices grew more urgent. Several people exchanged nervous glances. The young woman happened to pass by carrying a tray when she overheard part of the conversation. The pianist still hasn't arrived. We've called 3 times. Traffic is completely stopped because of the storm. What are we supposed to do? She continued walking but couldn't help listening. The evening's scheduled pianist was apparently stuck several hours away due to severe weather conditions. Without music, one of the most important parts of the event would be missing. The organizers were clearly running out of options. Guests continued arriving. The program was about to begin. and the pianist was nowhere close. For the next several minutes, various solutions were suggested and rejected. Nobody seemed to have an answer. Then something unexpected happened. One employee quietly spoke up. "I think she plays piano." The organizers looked confused. "Who?" The employee pointed across the room. "The staff member over there." The young woman froze when she realized they were talking about her. One of the organizers approached. "You play piano?" She hesitated. "A little." The answer wasn't entirely honest. Years of experience had taught her not to talk much about her musical background. People often misunderstood. Some assumed she was exaggerating. Others expected too much. Keeping quiet was easier. The organizer looked relieved. "Can you help us?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" "The pianist can't get here." He glanced toward the growing crowd. "We only need someone temporarily. Just enough to provide background music until we figure something out." Before she could answer, another organizer joined the conversation. "You don't need to play anything complicated." He offered a nervous smile. "Simple songs are fine." Nearby guests overheard the discussion. A few exchanged amused looks. One man chuckled softly. Another whispered something that caused his table to laugh. The young woman noticed. She had seen those expressions before. People often made assumptions based on appearances. A hotel employee couldn't possibly be a serious musician. At least that was what many seemed to believe. The organizer continued speaking. "Honestly, we just need something pleasant. Easy tunes. Nothing fancy." She looked toward the grand piano standing near the stage. It was beautiful. Polished black. Perfectly maintained. Far nicer than any instrument she had touched in years. For a brief moment, uncertainty filled her mind. What if she made a mistake? What if the audience laughed? What if years away from the spotlight had changed her more than she realized? Then another feeling appeared. A familiar feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Excitement. Not because people were watching. Not because she wanted attention. But because an opportunity had appeared. A chance to sit at a piano again. A chance to feel music beneath her fingertips. The organizer waited anxiously for an answer. Finally, she nodded. "I'll help." Relief immediately spread across his face. "Thank you." Word quickly spread through the ballroom. Some guests seemed curious. Others looked skeptical. A few appeared entertained by the situation. The young woman ignored them. She focused on taking slow breaths. One step at a time. The room continued filling with people. Conversations echoed throughout the hall. Glassware clinked. Servers moved between tables. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Meanwhile, she quietly walked toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not because she was afraid of the piano. The piano had always felt like home. What felt unfamiliar was everything surrounding it. The audience. The expectations. The years that had passed. When she finally reached the grand piano, she paused beside it. Her reflection stared back from the polished surface. For a second, memories flooded her mind. Childhood practice sessions. Music competitions. Long evenings spent chasing perfection. Dreams she thought had disappeared forever. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade. Only the piano remained. She gently placed her hand on its smooth surface. A small smile appeared. No matter how much time had passed, some things never truly left the heart. Then she took her seat. Across the ballroom, guests turned their attention toward the stage. Some watched with curiosity, others with doubt, a few with amusement. The organizers stood nearby, hoping everything would go well. The young woman adjusted the bench and rested her fingers lightly above the keys. The room waited. Nobody knew that the next few minutes would change the entire evening. And nobody could imagine that the quiet hotel employee sitting before them was about to reveal a side of herself that had remained hidden for years. The ballroom remained quiet as the young woman sat at the grand piano. Hundreds of eyes were now focused on her. Some guests looked curious. Others seemed doubtful. A few wore small smiles that suggested they were expecting very little. She noticed all of it. Years ago, those expressions would have bothered her. Back then, she cared deeply about what people thought. Every opinion felt important. Life had changed that. Hardship had a way of teaching different lessons. When someone spends years working long hours, helping family, and overcoming challenges, they learn that not every judgment deserves attention. Even so, sitting under the bright lights wasn't easy. She slowly adjusted the piano bench. Her fingers rested gently above the keys. The instrument felt wonderful. The smooth surface, the familiar shape of the keyboard, the quiet anticipation before the first note. It all felt strangely comforting. For a moment, the ballroom disappeared. The guests disappeared. The pressure disappeared. There was only the piano. One of the organizers standing near the stage gave her an encouraging nod. She returned a small smile. Then she began. The first notes were soft and simple. Exactly what she had been asked to play. A familiar melody drifted through the room. Nothing flashy. Nothing complicated. Just gentle background music designed to create a pleasant atmosphere. Several guests immediately relaxed. The organizers exchanged relieved looks. At least the silence had been avoided. That alone felt like a victory. The young woman continued playing. Her hands moved naturally across the keyboard. Though the piece itself was simple, every note was clean and controlled. Years of training still lived inside her fingers. Skills she thought might have faded were returning surprisingly quickly. At first, few people paid much attention. Many guests continued talking. Some discussed business. Others laughed with friends. Waiters carried drinks between tables. The event proceeded as if nothing unusual was happening. From the audience's perspective, everything appeared exactly as expected. A hotel employee was playing a few easy songs. Nothing more. Near one of the tables, a group of guests watched briefly before returning to their conversation. "I guess she's doing her best," one of them said quietly. Another shrugged. "At least the organizers found someone." A third guest smiled politely. "She seems nervous." None of them meant any harm. Still, their assumptions were obvious. The young woman could hear pieces of conversations floating through the room. She wasn't offended. She understood. People often judged based on what they could see. They saw a hotel uniform. They saw someone filling in during an emergency. They had no reason to imagine anything else. She continued playing. One song ended. Another began. The melodies flowed smoothly from one piece to the next. The room remained comfortable and relaxed. After nearly 15 minutes, the organizers began checking their phones again. Still no sign of the scheduled pianist. The weather situation had apparently become worse. Road closures were causing major delays. No one knew when the musician would arrive. The young woman noticed the concern returning to their faces. She understood what they were thinking. The evening program would soon move into its most important portion. Background music was no longer enough. The event needed something memorable, something worthy of the elegant setting. Yet nobody seemed willing to ask for more. After all, she had only agreed to help temporarily, and everyone believed her abilities had limits. As she played another gentle tune, her thoughts drifted elsewhere. She remembered an old music teacher. The teacher had once said something she never forgot. "Most people play notes. The best musicians tell stories." At the time, she hadn't fully understood. She thought music was about accuracy, about speed, about avoiding mistakes. Years later, she finally understood what her teacher meant. Music became powerful when it carried emotion, when listeners could feel something, when a performance connected human experiences to sound. That was what she missed most. Not applause, not recognition, connection, the ability to tell a story without speaking. Her fingers continued moving effortlessly. The simple songs felt comfortable, safe, predictable. Yet deep inside, another feeling was growing. A quiet desire. She wanted to play something meaningful. Something that reminded her who she used to be. Not for the audience. For herself. Across the ballroom, an elderly guest sat listening more carefully than most. Unlike others, he hadn't returned to conversation. His attention remained fixed on the stage. Something about her playing had caught his interest. The songs themselves were simple, but the way she played them wasn't. There was confidence hidden beneath the restraint, control hidden beneath the simplicity. The guest narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Years earlier, he had spent time around professional musicians. He recognized certain details most people missed. The posture, the touch, the precision. Those qualities couldn't be learned overnight. The woman at the piano had experience. A great deal of it. Meanwhile, the young woman completed another piece. The final note faded gently into the room. Polite applause followed. Nothing dramatic. Just a few guests acknowledging the music. She smiled and nodded. Then she prepared for the next song. But before beginning, her gaze briefly drifted across the ballroom. She saw people chatting, checking phones, looking elsewhere. The music had become background noise. Exactly what everyone expected. Exactly what she had been asked to provide. Yet something inside her shifted. She remembered countless hours spent practicing difficult compositions. She remembered sacrificing weekends while friends enjoyed themselves. She remembered believing music would become her future. Most of all, she remembered how alive she felt whenever she truly played. Not when she performed easy melodies. When she challenged herself. When she poured everything into the music. The memory stirred emotions she hadn't felt in years. A strange mixture of sadness and hope. She lowered her eyes toward the keyboard. The polished black keys reflected the ballroom lights. For a few seconds, she simply sat there, thinking. The room assumed she was deciding which easy song to play next. Nobody realized she was making a different decision. One that would change the evening. Near the stage, one organizer quietly approached another. "Do you think we should ask her to keep going another 20 minutes? I don't see another choice." The first organizer nodded. "She's handling it well." Neither noticed the small smile appearing on the pianist's face. Because at that exact moment, she had already made up her mind. She would continue helping, but she would also give herself something she had been denying for years. One chance, one song, one opportunity to stop hiding. Not because she wanted attention, not because she wanted praise, because she wanted to remember. She wanted to feel what it was like to play without fear again. The applause faded completely. The ballroom settled. Guests returned to conversations. The atmosphere relaxed once more. Everyone expected another gentle tune, another safe selection, another pleasant background melody. The young woman lifted her hands from the keyboard for a brief second. Then she took a slow breath. Her heartbeat quickened. Not from anxiety, from anticipation. She knew exactly which piece she wanted to play. It wasn't easy. It wasn't simple. And it certainly wasn't background music. Years earlier, it had been one of her favorites. A demanding masterpiece that required skill, discipline, and emotion. A piece she had practiced hundreds of times. A piece that had once represented everything she loved about music. Part of her wondered whether she should take the risk. Maybe she should continue following expectations. Maybe she should remain invisible. That would certainly be safer. But another voice inside reminded her of something important. Opportunities don't always arrive twice. Sometimes life unexpectedly places a door in front of you. And if you don't walk through it, you may always wonder what might have happened. The ballroom remained unaware. Guests laughed. Servers moved quietly between tables. Glasses clinked. Conversations continued. Nobody noticed the determination growing behind her calm expression. She positioned her fingers carefully above the keys. The familiar sensation sent a wave of confidence through her. For the first time that evening, she felt completely ready. The simple songs were over. The safe choices were finished. The audience still believed they knew exactly who she was. Within moments, that belief would begin to disappear. And with the very first notes of the next piece, the entire room would start paying attention. The ballroom remained filled with quiet conversations. Guests continued enjoying their meals, discussing business deals, family stories, and plans for the future. Most of them still viewed the music as pleasant background sound. The young woman sat calmly at the grand piano. Her hands hovered over the keys. She could feel her heart beating a little faster. Not because she was afraid, because she finally knew what she wanted to do. For years, she had hidden an important part of herself. Not intentionally. Life had simply pulled her in different directions. Responsibilities came first. Bills came first. Family came first. Music had been pushed into the background. Now, sitting in front of the piano, she realized something. Even after all those years, the music inside her had never disappeared. It had only been waiting for the right moment. She took a slow breath. Then she pressed the first key. The sound that emerged was different from everything she had played earlier. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it carried a depth that immediately separated it from the simple melodies before it. A few nearby guests noticed. Their conversations continued, but their eyes briefly drifted toward the stage. The young woman continued. The next notes followed. Then another, and another. The melody slowly unfolded like the opening chapter of a powerful story. Something in the room began to shift. Not suddenly, gradually, almost invisibly. People who had been talking started lowering their voices. Several guests turned their chairs slightly toward the piano. Others paused in the middle of conversations without realizing it. The music demanded attention. Not because it was loud, because it was beautiful. Near the back of the ballroom, a server stopped for a moment while carrying a tray. He listened. His eyes widened slightly. He had heard the young woman practicing once in an empty room months earlier. Even then, he knew she was talented. But this sounded different. This sounded extraordinary. At one of the front tables, the elderly guest who had been observing her all evening leaned forward. His expression changed immediately. Now he was certain. The woman at the piano wasn't simply someone who knew how to play. She was a serious musician. Years of experience could be heard in every note. Meanwhile, the organizers standing near the stage exchanged confused glances. One of them whispered quietly, "Is this still the same person?" The other smiled nervously. Apparently, they were wondering the same thing. The piece continued building. The young woman's fingers moved effortlessly across the keyboard. Years earlier, this music had required intense concentration. Now something remarkable was happening. The notes seemed to return naturally, like reconnecting with an old friend. Every movement felt familiar. Every phrase felt alive. The piano responded beautifully beneath her hands. The instrument seemed to awaken. Rich tones filled the ballroom. Conversations became fewer. More guests turned toward the stage. People who had barely noticed her 20 minutes earlier were now watching closely. One woman sitting near the center of the room lowered her fork. Another guest stopped scrolling through his phone. Several attendees exchanged surprised looks. Nobody had expected this. The young woman remained completely focused. Her eyes rarely left the keyboard. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. In fact, she had almost forgotten the audience existed. For the first time in years, she felt free. The pressure of daily life disappeared. The stress of work disappeared. The worries she carried every day disappeared. Only the music remained. And through that music, something hidden inside her finally found a voice. The melody grew stronger, more confident, more demanding. Passages that required speed and precision began appearing. Her fingers moved rapidly. The audience watched in disbelief. Several guests who knew a little about music immediately recognized the difficulty. This wasn't something an average player could perform. Not even close. One guest quietly shook his head. "I don't understand." His friend looked equally confused. "What? She's a hotel employee." The friend stared at the stage. "Apparently she's much more than that." Nearby, another group had fallen completely silent. Their attention remained fixed on the pianist. The room was changing. The atmosphere was changing. And the young woman still hadn't reached the most powerful part of the piece. The music continued climbing. Layer after layer. Emotion after emotion. It felt less like entertainment and more like a conversation. A conversation spoken through sound instead of words. Listeners could feel joy, determination, hope, loss. Every note seemed connected to a life story nobody knew. The audience didn't know about the sacrifices she had made. They didn't know about the opportunities she had given up. They didn't know how many nights she had wondered what might have happened if life had taken a different path. Yet somehow they could feel those experiences in the music. That was the power of genuine performance. You didn't need explanations. You simply understood. At one point, the ballroom became so quiet that the sound of the piano seemed to fill every corner. Even the staff noticed. Servers paused briefly before continuing their work. Guests who had been standing moved closer. Several people near the entrance remained there instead of finding seats. Everyone seemed drawn toward the stage. The organizers stopped worrying about the missing pianist entirely. Nobody mentioned him anymore. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody discussed backup plans. All attention belonged to the young woman, and she still didn't realize what was happening around her. Her focus remained entirely on the keyboard. As the piece reached a more challenging section, memories flooded her mind. She remembered being a teenager practicing this same music late at night. She remembered repeating difficult passages over and over until they were perfect. She remembered dreaming about performing on large stages one day. For years, those memories had been painful. They reminded her of what she had lost. Tonight, however, they felt different. They felt warm, comforting, like old friends returning after a long absence. A small smile appeared on her face. The audience noticed. There was something special about that smile. It wasn't the smile of someone seeking approval. It was the smile of someone reconnecting with a part of themselves. That simple expression made the performance even more powerful. People weren't just hearing talent. They were witnessing genuine happiness. The elderly guest continued watching carefully. Years of experience had taught him how to recognize authenticity. Many musicians could play notes correctly. Far fewer could create emotional connection. The young woman was doing exactly that. And she wasn't doing it through dramatic gestures or showmanship. She was doing it through honesty. Every note felt real. As the music grew more intense, the room's attention became complete. No conversations remained. No distractions remained. The ballroom that had once buzzed with noise now listened in complete silence. The transformation was remarkable. Only 30 minutes earlier, many guests had barely acknowledged her presence. Now nobody could look away. A young waiter standing near the wall whispered softly to a colleague, "I've worked here 3 years. So, I never knew she could do this. Neither had anyone else." The piece continued building toward its emotional center. The piano seemed to sing. Fast passages flowed into delicate moments. Powerful sections blended with gentle melodies. The contrast kept listeners completely engaged. Nobody knew what would come next. Every phrase created anticipation. Every note carried purpose. The young woman felt herself becoming more confident with each passing minute. Any remaining doubts had vanished. The years away from performing no longer mattered. The audience no longer mattered. Fear no longer mattered. Music was guiding everything. And for the first time in a very long time, she trusted it completely. Several guests now had their phones out. Not because they were distracted, because they wanted to record what they were hearing. Instinctively, they understood this was a special moment. Something unexpected. Something memorable. Something they would talk about long after the evening ended. The young woman remained unaware. She simply continued playing. The next section approached. The section she remembered best. The section that had always been her favorite. The most demanding portion of the masterpiece. Years ago, mastering it had taken months of practice. Now it was only seconds away. The audience leaned forward. Even those without musical knowledge could sense something important was coming. The tension in the room increased. The anticipation increased. The music seemed to gather energy with every passing note. Then the young woman entered the next passage. Her fingers accelerated across the keyboard with breathtaking confidence. The sound exploded through the ballroom. Gasps escaped from several tables. Eyes widened throughout the room. People stared in complete disbelief. And in that moment, every person present realized the same thing. The quiet hotel employee sitting at the piano was not simply talented. She was extraordinary. The ballroom had become completely silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from boredom. Not the kind that comes from people waiting politely. This was a different kind of silence. Every person in the room was listening. The young woman continued playing, unaware of how deeply she had captured the audience. Her fingers moved confidently across the piano keys. Years of hidden practice, forgotten dreams, and quiet determination were pouring into every note. The music filled the room like a story unfolding chapter by chapter. Nobody wanted to interrupt it. Nobody wanted to miss a second. The guests who had been talking earlier now sat motionless. Several people leaned forward in their chairs. Others watched with expressions of disbelief. Many were still trying to understand how someone they had barely noticed earlier could possess such remarkable skill. Near the front of the ballroom, the elderly guest continued studying her carefully. The more he listened, the more convinced he became that there was much more to her story than anyone realized. He wasn't focused only on her technique. He was paying attention to something else. Emotion, experience, the kind of depth that only comes from living through difficult seasons of life. Great musicians often reveal themselves through feeling rather than perfection. And this performance was full of feeling. The elderly guest quietly stood and approached one of the hotel managers. Without taking his eyes off the stage, he asked a simple question. "How long has she worked here?" The manager looked surprised. "A few years." "Has she always played piano?" The manager shook his head. "Not that we knew. Honestly, most of us only learned about it tonight." The guest frowned slightly. "That doesn't make sense." "What do you mean?" "This level of skill doesn't appear overnight." The manager looked back toward the stage. "I agree." The elderly guest remained thoughtful. Something about her seemed familiar. Not her face. Not her name. Something else. A memory. A distant recollection from years earlier. Meanwhile, the young woman continued performing. The difficult passages flowed naturally. Every note seemed connected to the next. The piano almost felt like an extension of herself. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about tomorrow. She wasn't worrying about bills. She wasn't thinking about work schedules. She wasn't carrying the weight of responsibilities on her shoulders. She was simply present. And that feeling alone made the evening special. As she played, another memory surfaced. She remembered sitting beside her mother late one evening many years ago. At the time, she had been frustrated after losing a local competition. She had come home disappointed and discouraged. Her mother had listened quietly before offering simple advice. "You don't play music to defeat other people." The young woman had looked confused. "Then why do I play?" Her mother smiled. "Because it makes you feel alive." At the time, those words seemed ordinary. Now they felt profound. Because sitting at that piano, she finally understood them completely. Across the ballroom, the audience was experiencing something similar. Many had arrived expecting another predictable charity event. Pleasant evening. A few speeches. A nice dinner. Then a return to normal life. Instead, they had become part of an unforgettable moment. One guest quietly wiped tears from her eyes. The reaction surprised even her. She couldn't explain exactly why the music affected her so deeply. Simply did. Another guest sat with folded hands, completely absorbed. The performance reminded him of dreams he had abandoned years earlier. Dreams he rarely allowed himself to think about. The music seemed to awaken memories in people. Not because of what was being played, because of how it was being played. Everyone could feel the sincerity behind it. Near the entrance, two staff members watched from a distance. One shook his head in amazement. "I had no idea." "Neither did I," the other replied. "Imagine carrying that kind of talent and never talking about it." The first employee thought for a moment. Maybe she never needed people to know. That observation was more accurate than he realized. The young woman had never sought attention. Life had taught her humility. When circumstances forced her away from music, she accepted the reality in front of her. She worked hard. She helped others. She moved forward. But she never stopped loving the piano. Even when nobody was listening. Even when nobody knew. even when it felt like those dreams belonged to another lifetime. Back near the stage, the elderly guest suddenly remembered something. A specific event. A youth music competition many years earlier. A young pianist had performed there. The audience had been amazed. Several judges predicted a bright future. The guest remembered because he had attended that event himself. He couldn't remember every detail, but he remembered the feeling. The same feeling he was experiencing now. Curious, he approached another staff member. "Do you know her full name?" The employee quietly provided it. The guest's eyes widened. For a moment he simply stood there. Then he nodded slowly. It was her. The talented young pianist from years ago. The one many people believed would eventually perform on major stages. The one who seemed destined for a successful musical career. The realization left him speechless. He looked back toward the stage. Suddenly the story made more sense. The confidence, the skill, the emotional depth. This wasn't hidden talent being discovered. This was extraordinary talent returning after years of silence. The guest felt a mixture of admiration and sadness. Admiration for her ability. Sadness for the opportunities she must have missed. Yet watching her now, he sensed something important. She wasn't playing with bitterness. She wasn't performing with regret. She was playing with gratitude. And that made the performance even more powerful. The music continued flowing through the ballroom. Every section seemed to reveal another piece of her story. Not literally. The audience didn't know the details, but they could feel the emotions. Determination, perseverance, hope, resilience. All of it lived inside the music. The organizers stood near the side of the stage, completely captivated. Earlier in the evening, they had worried about saving the event. Now they were witnessing something far better than anything they could have planned. One organizer quietly laughed. "I can't believe this happened." The other smiled. "Neither can I. If the original pianist walked through that door right now, I don't think anyone would notice." Both laughed softly, because it was true. The entire evening had changed direction. And it had happened because one employee agreed to help. The young woman remained focused. She still had no idea that people were discussing her history. She didn't know the elderly guest had recognized her. She didn't know how many assumptions throughout the room were disappearing. All she knew was that she felt connected to the piano again. Connected in a way she hadn't experienced for years. And that feeling was priceless. As the piece moved into another emotional section, the audience remained completely engaged. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. Many were beginning to reflect on their own lives. How often had they judged someone too quickly? How often had they assumed they understood a person based on appearance alone? How often had they overlooked someone standing right in front of them? The performance was becoming more than music. It was becoming a reminder that every person carries a story. A reminder that talent, strength, and resilience often exist where nobody expects them. The young woman had arrived at the ballroom as a hotel employee. Nothing more. At least in the eyes of most guests. Now those same people were seeing her differently. Not because she had changed. Because they finally had the chance to see who she had always been. The music continued building. The emotional intensity increased. The audience felt it. The atmosphere felt charged with anticipation. Everyone sensed that the performance was moving toward something extraordinary. Something unforgettable. The young woman felt it too. The most powerful section of the masterpiece was approaching. Her hands remained steady. Her confidence remained strong. Years of experience guided every movement. And as the next series of notes began, the audience found themselves holding their breath, eager to hear what would happen next. The ballroom seemed frozen in time. No one was speaking. No one was checking their phones. No one was paying attention to anything except the woman sitting at the grand piano. The music had completely taken over the room. What had started as a simple solution to an unexpected problem had become the center of the entire evening. The young woman remained focused on the keys. She could feel the piece reaching its most important section. Every note carried emotion. Every phrase carried meaning. The audience could sense it too. Something special was unfolding before them. Something they would remember long after the event ended. The powerful section she had been approaching was finally here. Years ago, this was the part she loved most. Not because it was difficult. Not because it impressed audiences. Because it demanded complete honesty. A musician couldn't hide inside this section. Every emotion became visible through the music. Every thought found its way into the notes. The young woman closed her eyes briefly as her hands continued moving. The piano responded beautifully. Rich tones echoed through the ballroom. The sound seemed larger than the room itself. Several guests sat completely motionless. Some had forgotten about their meals. Others had forgotten where they were. The performance had drawn them into another world. Near the front table, the elderly guest continued listening carefully. His expression had softened. Earlier he had been curious. Now he felt something closer to admiration. Not only for her talent, for her strength. Life had clearly taken her down a different path than the one many expected. Yet somehow she had protected her gift. She had carried it quietly through years of responsibility and sacrifice. And now that gift was shining brighter than ever. The music continued building. The tempo increased. The energy increased. The audience felt the momentum growing. A sense of anticipation spread throughout the ballroom. People instinctively leaned forward. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The young woman's fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. The years seemed to disappear completely. She no longer felt like someone who had stepped away from music. She felt like herself again. The person she had always been. The person she thought she had left behind. For so long she had measured life through obligations. Schedules. Bills. Responsibilities. Tonight reminded her that another part of her still existed. The dreamer. The artist. The musician. The realization filled her with unexpected emotion. For a brief moment her eyes became misty. Yet her hands never hesitated. The music continued flowing flawlessly. Across the room, several guests noticed the emotion on her face. It made the performance even more powerful. This wasn't someone trying to entertain a crowd. This was someone reconnecting with a lifelong passion. People could feel the authenticity. And authenticity is difficult to ignore. One guest quietly whispered to the person beside him, "This doesn't feel like a performance." The other nodded. "It feels like we're witnessing something personal." That was exactly why the room had become so captivated. Everyone understood they were seeing something real. Not rehearsed. Not manufactured. Real. Near the stage, the event organizers exchanged another look. Neither could believe how dramatically the evening had changed. Only an hour earlier they had been worried about embarrassment. They had feared disappointment. Now they were witnessing one of the most memorable moments ever experienced at the venue. One organizer quietly laughed. "We spent all evening worrying about the missing pianist." The other smiled. "I think fate had different plans." Neither could argue with that. The audience remained completely engaged. The music continued rising toward its climax. Each section seemed more powerful than the last. Each passage revealed new layers of emotion. The young woman felt as though years of silence were being released through the piano. Every dream she had set aside. Every challenge she had overcome. Every sacrifice she had made. The ballroom seemed frozen in time. No one was speaking. No one was checking their phones. No one was paying attention to anything except the woman sitting at the grand piano. The music had completely taken over the room. What had started as a simple solution to an unexpected problem had become the center of the entire evening. The young woman remained focused on the keys. She could feel the piece reaching its most important section. Every note carried emotion. Every phrase carried meaning. The audience could sense it too. Something special was unfolding before them. Something they would remember long after the event ended. The powerful section she had been approaching was finally here. Years ago, this was the part she loved most. Not because it was difficult. Not because it impressed audiences. Because it demanded complete honesty. A musician couldn't hide inside this section. Every emotion became visible through the music. Every thought found its way into the notes. The young woman closed her eyes briefly as her hands continued moving. The piano responded beautifully. Rich tones echoed through the ballroom. The sound seemed larger than the room itself. Several guests sat completely motionless. Some had forgotten about their meals. Others had forgotten where they were. The performance had drawn them into another world. Near the front table, the elderly guest continued listening carefully. His expression had softened. Earlier he had been curious. Now he felt something closer to admiration. Not only for her talent, for her strength. Life had clearly taken her down a different path than the one many expected. Yet somehow she had protected her gift. She had carried it quietly through years of responsibility and sacrifice. And now that gift was shining brighter than ever. The music continued building. The tempo increased. The energy increased. The audience felt the momentum growing. A sense of anticipation spread throughout the ballroom. People instinctively leaned forward. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The young woman's fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. The years seemed to disappear completely. She no longer felt like someone who had stepped away from music. She felt like herself again. The person she had always been. The person she thought she had left behind. For so long she had measured life through obligations. Schedules, bills, responsibilities. Tonight reminded her that another part of her still existed. The dreamer, the artist, the musician. The realization filled her with unexpected emotion. For a brief moment her eyes became misty, yet her hands never hesitated. The music continued flowing flawlessly. Across the room, several guests noticed the emotion on her face. It made the performance even more powerful. This wasn't someone trying to entertain a crowd. This was someone reconnecting with a lifelong passion. People could feel the authenticity. And authenticity is difficult to ignore. One guest quietly whispered to the person beside him, "This doesn't feel like a performance." The other nodded. "It feels like we're witnessing something personal." That was exactly why the room had become so captivated. Everyone understood they were seeing something real. Not rehearsed. Not manufactured. Real. Near the stage, the event organizers exchanged another look. Neither could believe how dramatically the evening had changed. Only an hour earlier they had been worried about embarrassment. They had feared disappointment. Now they were witnessing one of the most memorable moments ever experienced at the venue. One organizer quietly laughed. "We spent all evening worrying about the missing pianist." The other smiled. "I think fate had different plans." Neither could argue with that. The audience remained completely engaged. The music continued rising toward its climax. Each section seemed more powerful than the last. Each passage revealed new layers of emotion. The young woman felt as though years of silence were being released through the piano. Every dream she had set aside, every challenge she had overcome, every sacrifice she had made, all of it found expression in the music. Not through sadness, through resilience. The piece wasn't telling a story about loss. It was telling a story about perseverance, about continuing forward even when life changes direction. That message resonated deeply with the audience. Many people in the room had experienced their own disappointments, their own setbacks, their own unfinished dreams. Perhaps that was why they connected with the performance so strongly. The emotions felt familiar, human, universal. As the music grew more intense, several guests unconsciously held their breath. The tension in the room became almost tangible. Everyone sensed the climax approaching. The young woman sensed it too. Her confidence remained steady. Years of training guided her hands. Muscle memory took over. The piano became an extension of her thoughts. Every movement felt natural, effortless, beautiful. The ballroom's enormous chandeliers reflected softly on the piano's polished surface. The elegant setting seemed to disappear behind the music. Nothing else mattered. Not the decorations. Not the speeches still waiting to happen. Not the delayed schedule. Only the performance existed. One of the hotel employees stood quietly near a doorway. He had worked countless events over the years. Weddings, galas, fundraisers, corporate celebrations. Yet he had never seen a room react like this. The silence alone was remarkable. Hundreds of people sat completely absorbed. Nobody wanted the moment to end. The young woman entered the final major section of the masterpiece. Immediately, the atmosphere shifted again. The music became larger, bolder, more dramatic. Gasps escaped from several guests. The technical difficulty was impossible to ignore now. Even those with no musical background could recognize the extraordinary level of skill required. Her fingers seemed to glide effortlessly across the keys. The speed was astonishing. The precision was astonishing. Yet, despite the complexity, the music never felt mechanical. It remained full of warmth and feeling. That combination left the audience speechless. The elderly guest smiled. Now he understood something important. The years away from public performance had not diminished her gift. In some ways, they had deepened it. Life experience had added something impossible to teach. Perspective, emotion, wisdom. Those qualities could not be learned from practice alone. They came from living, and they were present in every note. The young woman continued moving toward the conclusion. She knew the piece was nearing its end. A small part of her wish time would slow down. She didn't want the feeling to disappear. For the first time in years, she felt completely connected to herself. Completely free. The audience sensed the ending approaching as well. No one moved. No one spoke. The anticipation became almost overwhelming. The music surged forward. Powerful chords filled the ballroom. The sound echoed beautifully through the space. Several guests stared in complete amazement. Others smiled through tears. Many simply sat quietly, absorbing the moment. The final sequence began. The young woman's heart raced. Not from fear, from joy. Pure joy. Every note felt alive. Every note felt meaningful. The piano seemed to sing beneath her hands. The audience watched in complete awe. The final moments arrived. A series of breathtaking passages flowed one after another. The music climbed higher, stronger, brighter. Then came the final chord progression. The audience leaned forward. The room seemed to hold its breath. One last phrase. One final surge of emotion. One final expression of everything she had carried inside for years. Her hands moved confidently. The final notes rang out across the ballroom. Beautiful, powerful, unforgettable. Then it was over. Her fingers lifted from the keyboard. The last note echoed softly through the room. And then came silence. Complete silence. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The young woman sat quietly at the piano. Her breathing slowed. A mixture of emotions filled her heart. Gratitude, relief, happiness. She looked down at the keys. The room remained silent. The moment felt suspended in time. Then she slowly raised her head. As she looked out across the ballroom, she realized something had changed. Every face was turned toward her. Every eye was filled with admiration. The guests who had barely noticed her earlier were now staring in amazement. And just as she began to understand what had happened, someone in the audience rose from their chair. Then another, and another. Within moments, the entire ballroom was on its feet. A thunderous standing ovation was about to begin. For a few seconds after the final note faded away, the ballroom remained completely silent. The young woman sat motionless at the piano. Her hands rested gently in her lap. She wasn't sure what to expect. She had become so focused on the music that she had almost forgotten there was an audience watching. The silence felt endless. Then someone began clapping. A single pair of hands broke the quiet. Another person joined. Then another. And another. Within moments, the entire ballroom exploded with applause. The sound was overwhelming. Guests rose from their chairs across the room. One table after another stood until nearly everyone was on their feet. The standing ovation filled the ballroom. The young woman's eyes widened. She had not expected this. Not even close. A few minutes earlier she had simply been helping solve an unexpected problem. Now hundreds of people were applauding her with genuine admiration. She looked around the room, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. The applause continued. People smiled. Some cheered. Others simply kept clapping. The appreciation felt sincere. For the first time that evening, she felt slightly overwhelmed. Not because of the attention, because she realized how deeply the music had connected with people. And that meant more to her than any applause ever could. Slowly, she stood from the piano bench. She offered a humble nod toward the audience. The applause grew even louder. Several guests exchanged amazed looks. They knew they had witnessed something special. The organizers approached the stage with huge smiles. Neither could stop laughing. The stress that had consumed them earlier had completely disappeared. One of them shook his head. "I still can't believe what just happened." The other laughed. "Neither can I." The young woman stepped away from the piano. Before she could leave the stage, several guests approached. One person wanted to congratulate her. Then another. Soon a small crowd had gathered around her. Everyone seemed eager to speak. Everyone wanted to know more. She listened politely and thanked each person. Despite the praise, she remained humble. That had always been her nature. One guest asked where she had studied music. Another asked how long she had been playing. Someone else asked why she worked at the hotel if she possessed such extraordinary talent. The questions came one after another. She answered honestly. Life had simply taken her in a different direction. The guests listened carefully. Many were touched by her story. They had expected to hear about a successful concert career. Instead, they learned about sacrifice, family responsibilities, hard work, perseverance. The more they learned, the more they admired her. Across the ballroom, the elderly guest finally made his way through the crowd. When he reached her, he smiled warmly. "I knew I recognized your playing." She looked surprised. "You did?" He nodded. "I heard you perform many years ago." For a moment, she simply stared at him. The memory slowly returned. The competition, the audience, the excitement she had felt back then. It seemed like another lifetime. The elderly guest smiled. "Back then, everyone believed you had a remarkable future." The young woman lowered her eyes briefly. "Life had other plans." The guest nodded. "Perhaps." Then he added something she would never forget. "Or perhaps your future was only delayed." The words stayed with her. Delayed. Not lost. Delayed. For years she had quietly accepted that her musical journey was over. She never complained. She never blamed anyone. But deep inside, she had assumed that chapter of her life had ended. Now she wasn't so sure. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Guests kept discussing the performance. Even during speeches and presentations, people continued mentioning the young woman at the piano. Some replayed videos they had recorded. Others shared photos with friends. The performance had become the highlight of the event. Not the planned program. Not the scheduled entertainment. Her. Eventually, the originally scheduled pianist arrived. The weather delays had finally cleared. The musician entered the ballroom expecting to apologize for the situation. Instead, he found guests talking excitedly about a performance he had missed. Curious, he asked what had happened. Several attendees immediately showed him recordings. He watched quietly. The room around him seemed to disappear as he focused on the video. When it ended, he smiled. Then he asked a simple question. "Where is she?" A few minutes later, he found the young woman speaking with guests. Rather than feeling upset about being replaced, he approached her with genuine respect. "I just watched your performance." She looked slightly embarrassed. "Oh," he smiled warmly. "You were wonderful." The compliment meant a great deal coming from an accomplished professional. She thanked him. The two spent several minutes discussing music. It was the first time in years she had enjoyed a conversation like that. A conversation centered not on work schedules or responsibilities, but on passion, art, creativity, the things she had once loved so deeply. As the evening drew closer to an end, something unexpected happened. Several guests approached her with opportunities. One represented a local arts organization. Another was involved in community concerts. A third worked with a music foundation that supported talented performers. Each person offered encouragement. Each person suggested ways she could reconnect with music. The young woman listened carefully. Part of her wanted to dismiss the offers immediately. After all, she had responsibilities. A job, family obligations, a practical life she couldn't simply abandon. Yet another part of her felt hopeful. Perhaps there was room for both. Perhaps she didn't need to choose between responsibility and passion. Perhaps there was a way to honor both. The idea stayed with her. As the event finally ended, guests slowly began leaving. Many stopped to thank her one last time. Several said the performance had inspired them. Others admitted they had judged her too quickly when she first sat at the piano. The young woman appreciated their honesty. She understood completely. People often make assumptions. Everyone does. What mattered was being willing to see beyond them. Eventually, the ballroom emptied. The noise faded. The excitement settled. For the first time all evening, the room became quiet again. Only a few staff members remained. The chandeliers still glowed overhead. The grand piano stood exactly where it had before. The young woman looked at it one final time. Hours earlier, she had approached that piano carrying uncertainty. She had wondered whether she still belonged behind the keyboard. Now she had her answer. A hotel manager approached her. "You know," he said, smiling, "I don't think anyone here will ever look at you the same way again." She laughed softly. "Maybe that's okay." The manager nodded. "It definitely is." After finishing her final responsibilities, she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. Outside, the night air felt cool and refreshing. The storm that had delayed the original pianist had finally passed. The streets were calm. The sky was clear. She stood for a moment looking upward. The evening replayed in her mind. The first notes, the audience, the standing ovation, the conversations, the opportunities. It all felt almost unreal. Yet one feeling remained stronger than everything else. Gratitude. Not because people had applauded. Not because people had praised her. Because she had rediscovered something important. A part of herself she thought was gone. As she began walking home, she realized the evening had given her more than a memorable experience. It had given her permission. Permission to dream again. Permission to believe that some dreams never truly disappear. They simply wait patiently until the right moment returns. The guests would remember the performance for years. The organizers would remember the unexpected miracle that saved the event. The videos would continue spreading among friends and families. But for the young woman, the most important thing wasn't what others remembered. It was what she remembered. That talent doesn't vanish when life becomes difficult. That passion can survive even the longest silence. And that sometimes the opportunity you've been waiting for arrives when you least expect it. She had been asked to play a simple piano tune. Instead, she reminded an entire room, and herself, that extraordinary things often come from the people the world overlooks. And as she disappeared into the quiet night, she carried something far more valuable than applause. She carried hope, the kind of hope that can change the course of a life.